Can Ilia Tuporia become the next GOAT in the UFC? Why make this video on Ilia Tuporia out of all the fighters on the roster? And most importantly, who is the current GOAT in the UFC? I'm going to break down all those questions and more today. If you haven't already liked and subscribed, please don't forget to do so. It helps boost this channel and the algorithm. With that all out of the way, let's get into the breakdown. So first I want to look at a couple numbers. First of all, Ilia is 27 years old. This makes him the youngest active UFC champion by 2 years as well. Sean O'Malley is the second youngest active champion at 29 years old. Winning the belt at 27 is huge. If we look at some of the current GOATs, I think Demetrius Johnson won the belt around 25, 26. I can't remember the exact age. I know GSP won the belt at 25, lost it immediately, won it back at 27, and then went on his notorious run. John Jones, of course, we all know is the youngest champ ever. He won it at 23. So you need to win the belt relatively young to go on the run needed to become the GOAT. Now, I will get into comparing what he'll have to do to some of the GOATs later in the video, but right now let's look at some of the numbers of what Ilia's done so far. That'll kind of give us an idea of what he's capable of. So, like I said, he's 27 years old. He's very young. He hasn't actually hit his prime yet. He's probably just getting into those prime years. Being a younger fighter, his prime's probably somewhere from 25, 27. That's probably the start of his prime up till 32 to 35. That's usually the prime for those smaller weight classes. He's also 15-0. So being undefeated is huge. Of course, John Jones, the Hamill fight doesn't really count. And the DC fight, we'll see if that ever gets overturned or not. But John Jones, as we all know, is undefeated. Khabib is undefeated, so he often gets considered in the GOAT category. I don't actually have Khabib top 5, probably not even top 10. He'd kind of be on the outskirts of my top 10. And I'm the biggest Khabib fan. I just don't think that he had enough names on his resume. And we'll get to that too, because that's another important thing. You need to rack up names, and you need to rack up fights, and you need to go on a long win streak. But another big part is being undefeated. Now, it's not the only thing. Being undefeated, it's not the end-all, be-all when it comes to the GOAT discussion. Of course, Demetrius Johnson, GSP, those are guys who are often considered the greatest of all time as well. Both of those fighters have losses. It's just the difference is that they avenged their losses, and they avenged their losses very, very well, especially in GSP's situation. He came back almost immediately and got those losses back. So a couple other numbers that I want to look at is how Ilia's come by those wins. So he's had 2 decisions. That's it. Out of those 15 fights, only 2 decisions. And both of those decisions were because the guy he was fighting was just unknockoutable. The first guy who he went, I think, the full distance with, I think it was 3 rounds, he actually has never been knocked out before, and he's the same age as Ilia. He's also 27. I can't remember his name. And then there was Josh Emmett most recently, and Josh Emmett has only been knocked out once in his career, and it was from one of the most devastating punchers in that division, Jeremy Stephens, who hit him with an elbow that I think would have knocked out a heavyweight. So for the most part, Ilia finishes his fights. He has 5 KOs so far, which he's kind of gotten more recently in his career. And he started his career with 7 submissions in a row. He has 8 submissions in total. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a second here. Another quick thing I want to mention before I get into kind of what he's done in his career so far is that the fact that Ilia's fought at 135, 145, and 155. This is huge to consider when we're talking about who can become the GOAT, because while Ilia might not be able to go on the win streak like John Jones or Anderson Silva had, he might be able to get belts in multiple weight classes, which I think would balance the scales a bit. So he might not be able to go on that 16-fight winning streak, but he might be able to win 2 to 3 belts, which I think would level the scales a bit. So that is one thing to consider. But let's talk about his early career so far. So I believe Ilia started his martial arts journey with Greco-Roman wrestling. I believe that's correct. And that is a huge asset to have. I am somebody who is in love with wrestling. I watch all the wrestling I possibly can. I watch collegiate wrestling, I watch Olympic wrestling, I watch Greco-Roman, I watch freestyle, I watch everything. I love wrestling, and while I'm more a fan of freestyle, that tends to be my kind of bread and butter, that's what I like to do as well. Greco-Roman does seem to be a little bit more useful for MMA, at least it's a little bit more efficient. You see like the best guys who use their wrestling, the guys who use the wrestling the best have been guys like Randy Couture or John Jones. Those are Greco-Roman wrestlers. They use a lot of body locks and hip throws from the clinch. And they're very, very effective at that. If you're going to use a freestyle style of wrestling in the UFC, you need to make that like your whole game plan. That needs to be That needs to be basically everything you do, because if you're shooting for legs, you can't just shoot them haphazardly. You have to go all the way. You have to go 100% on those legs, and you need to finish those takedowns. So there's a couple guys who have done that, Habib being one of them. That's why he's one of my favorite fighters of all time. Guys who can make freestyle wrestling their game plan. That's just so cool to me. Guys like Bo Nickel as well. I love guys who can dominate in that fashion, but it's not for everybody. You have to be very, very high level in order to do that, and you have to have a crazy gas tank. You have to want to wrestle for 5 rounds. It takes a lot of effort to do that, where I think Greco-Roman wrestling is a little bit more useful for the average fighter. A lot of those, body lock throws are very, very useful from the clinch. So I love that Ilia has that skill set. Now, another thing that I want to highlight is that he started his career with 7 straight submissions, 6 of them being in the first round. Now, most of these fights were in Spain, and a lot of you guys are going to say, well, he was fighting plumbers and tomato cans, and none of these fights should really even count on his record. I understand that argument. Fighting people with very, very low skill level, you kind of are expected to beat them, especially if you're now the UFC champ. But he did do it in the most devastating fashion possible. He wasn't going to decisions with these guys, and he wasn't knocking them out in kind of a brutal fashion. He was kind of taking it easy on these guys, taking them down and submitting them quickly. Another thing that I want to highlight is with those 7 submissions that he started his career off with, we saw 5 different submissions from him. We saw a triangle armbar, a guillotine, an anaconda choke, a regular triangle, and a rear naked choke. So we saw 5 different submissions. So I think it's safe to say that Ilia is like a very, very high-level black belt in jiu-jitsu, along with the Greco-Roman wrestling. Another quick thing I want to highlight is some of the names that Ilia has beaten so far. So he's fought in Emmett and Damon Jackson, both of which are wrestlers. Both of those guys are legitimate wrestlers who are hard to take down. Now, Emmett doesn't always use his wrestling. He kind of uses it as a countermeasure, and he likes to strike with his hands. So I do understand that he's not, a wrestling heavy type fighter, but Ilia has so far beaten 2 wrestlers. He's also beaten 2 very, very high level jiu-jitsu guys so far. He beat Bryce Mitchell and Ryan Hall. Now, he knocked Ryan Hall out pretty silly because Ryan Hall was trying to play the leg game. And Bryce Mitchell, he choked out in a pretty vicious fashion. So we can see that he can handle those crafty, elusive jiu-jitsu guys already. That's awesome to see that he has both of those names on his resume. Another fight I want to highlight is the Jai Herbert fight, because Jai Herbert in the first round threw a head kick that should have knocked Ilia out. I think it would have knocked out anybody, but somehow Ilia ate that, came back, and then knocked Herbert out in the next round. So seeing that determination and that chin that he has, I know he got dropped, but that kick should have knocked him out completely. And he came back from that. That just shows me that he has a chin as well. So that's awesome to see. I also want to highlight his fight with Volk, because I think that that's a really big win. Volkanovski was the #1 pound-for-pound fighter for a long time. He's still considered one of the top pound-for-pound fighters, and even though he came off of that loss to Islam a little bit quick, and he is aging a little bit, I think he's like 35 now, I still think that the way that Ilia pressured him, called the shot, called knocking him out in the first round, pressured him, and just found that knockout so swiftly and was able to work around Volk with his combinations in a way that we never saw Max do it. I thought that was really special, because he beat Volk basically just with his hands. And Islam was a little bit different. Islam had to mix in the wrestling, and then he fought Volk on short notice and caught him with a deadly head kick that would have knocked out anybody. Ilia was a little bit different. Now, I know he was just coming off of that KO loss. I know that Volk wasn't quite the same. I understand that argument. But what Ilia did was amazing. He absolutely melted the pound-for-pound best fighter on the planet. So I think that that's another thing to consider, that, Ilia's kind of he's already kind of had his hardest fight in a way. Now, that being said, he might move up to 155 in the future, and I think Islam Makhachev is a much harder fight for Ilia than Volk would have been for Ilia, but we'll get to that in a second. Next, I want to highlight Ilia's skills. So next, I'm going to highlight some of the main skills and attributes that Ilia has. I'm not going to go over every single attribute and skill that I could possibly go over, or else we'll be here all day, but I'm going to give like kind of an A, B+, C kind of grading to what I think Ilia is good at. So in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I'm going to give him an A+. That might be a little bit high of a rating, A+ kind of being the highest rating in this case. You might think that that's a bit of a high rating, but I think the way that he started his career with those 7 submissions, 6 of them being in the first round, we saw 5 different types of submissions. I think that that really proves that this guy can be an absolute menace on the ground, and I think he can choke out absolutely anybody in 145, 135, and possibly 155, but I'm getting ahead of myself there. Wrestling, I think he's also an A+. Like I said, he's a little bit more of a Greco-Roman style wrestler rather than a freestyle wrestler. I have seen him shoot for the legs a couple times, but for the most part, he's more so of a body lock kind of guy. And I think that that's actually the most effective for MMA, as I stated earlier. So I'm going to give his wrestling an A+ as well. Now, when it comes to his boxing, here's where I wish I can give him an A++, because I truly believe that Ilia has the best boxing in the UFC, maybe the best boxing the sport has ever seen, like MMA across all the boards. His boxing is truly something special. When you watch it, he does at some points look like a professional boxer, like someone like Lomachenko or Crawford. The way that he cuts angles, the way that he dips with his hips, shifts his shoulders to find new angles for punches, the way he puts combinations together. He'll post in the middle of a combination, he'll pull back, and then he'll come and counter you with a hook. It is beautiful. You just got to watch the fight with Emmett to see what I mean. His boxing is beautiful. Now, do I think that he can go in there and beat a Terrence Crawford tomorrow? No, absolutely not. There's levels to boxing, of course. But I think Ilia, the way that he boxes, some of the things that he mixes in, I've never seen in MMA. I've seen in boxing, of course, but I've never seen really MMA fighters do it. And I think that his boxing is an A+, if not an A++. Moving on to kickboxing, I would just give him an A. I wouldn't give him an A+ because he doesn't use a ton of kicks. He's not a head kick heavy guy or a body kick heavy guy. He does have a nice body kick, and I wish he would throw some more kicks to the legs. But I think that that's something that can evolve with his game. Like I said, he's only 27. He could still add a lot more tools from now till 32, 35, right? So I'm going to give his kickboxing an A for now, maybe a B-, or a B+, I should say. But let's move on to footwork. Footwork, I'd give him an A+. His footwork is great. It's his head movement that I have a problem with, and I'll get onto that in a second. But his footwork and the way that he darts in and out is perfect. He's always maintaining distance perfectly, and you can really tell that this guy has spent some time in the boxing ring just moving around with real boxers. I don't know who he's sparred with, if he's sparred with any pro boxers, but I can almost tell by his movement that he's definitely been in there with some pro guys, because he manages distance so well. And that's a big thing to have, especially if you're going to become, one of the GOATs. You're going to have to be able to manage distance like John Jones, Demetrius Johnson, and GSP. They were all masters of that, right? So moving on to his head movement, that's the one area where I see a tiny issue. Now, he does have good head movement. He does know where to place his head, how to get off of the center line, how to shift angles. All of that's perfect, but sometimes when he's in the middle of combinations, He brings his hands back quickly, but he leaves his head a little bit stagnant for me, and that's where he's been hit with a couple shots in his career. Now, they weren't big shots. Of course, the Jai Herbert one we'll put aside because, that was a head kick, but the shots that he's been hit with, punches-wise, have been they haven't been bad. Like, they haven't rocked him or dropped him too bad so far, but I would like him to move his head a little bit more in the pocket when he's in the middle of combinations. When he's kind of throwing one for one, he's great with the head movement. It's when he gets caught up in his combinations, his head starts to stay in the center there, and it becomes a bit of a target. But I would still give his head movement an A. I still think that it's better than most fighters on the roster. Next up is speed. Speed, I'm giving an A+. I think Ilia's speed is absolutely tremendous. I think you put him in there with Arnold Allen, you put him in there with Max Holloway, and he's really going to show just how fast he is with those hands. I think he has tremendous speed for 145. I'm not going to compare him to a 125 or anything, but I think for 145, he's probably the fastest, if not one of the top 3 fastest fighters in that division. So A+ for speed. For power, I'll give an A. I probably should give an A+, but I don't think it's so much natural power that he has rather than it is just accuracy with his punches. He is so precise and so accurate that he can find your chin, and any punch that's landing precisely on your chin is just, it's going to hurt or it's going to knock you out, right? So I don't know if he has A+ power, but you definitely could make that argument if he gets a couple more knockouts, because his knockouts have been pretty vicious. Now, accuracy. That's where I give him an A+. Accuracy and precision, A+. He finds the target with most of his punches. I truly think he's one of the highest percentage-wise for landing punches in 145. And yeah, he's he's got what is that, aim lock on for sure. Sometimes when he throws combinations, I'm like, oh man, he's got a modded controller or something. Chin, I'm going to give him an A+ for chin. I know it's just the Jai Herbert fight that we base it off of, but that head kick, that could have knocked out a heavyweight. That was a devastating head kick, and he got right back up from that and knocked him out. Like he wasn't really even out of it. He came right back to, and he was ready to go. So I think Ilia probably has an A+ chin. That's not something that you want to necessarily test throughout your career, but it is good to have in your back pocket. Like John Jones, you know, for so long we kind of didn't even know if he had a great chin, but then in the Reyes fight and the Gustafsson fight, we're like, okay, John has a chin. That's good to know. If he had a shaky chin, he probably would have lost a couple fights. So that's a good thing to have in your back pocket. Next up, I'll do just takedowns and submissions. I kind of already went over wrestling and jiu-jitsu, so I'll give him an A+ in both. I think his takedowns, for the most part, have been perfect. The technique is perfectly executed, and all of his submissions have been very, very tight, very well finished. I can't really critique his jiu-jitsu game at all, or his wrestling game, so I'm going to give him an A+ in both of those categories. So let's move on to kind of his trajectory and comparing him to some of the current GOATs and who those current GOATs are. So, in comparing him to current GOATs, I'm going to use 3 names. I'm not going to use Anderson Silva. I'm not going to use Jose Aldo. I'm not going to use DC or Conor McGregor. I'm just going to use GSP, DJ, and Jones. Those seem to be the most consensus top 3 when it comes to the GOAT conversation. Now, I can make a separate video talking about who I think the GOAT is, but for now, I'm just going to use those 3 to compare Ilia to. So, for Ilia to become the GOAT and surpass those 3 guys, he has a long way to go. 27 right now, we're probably looking at 8 to 10 years before he gets to somewhere where we're looking like, okay, yeah, you know what, he has the record, he's definitely better than John Jones. But basically, ideally, he needs to stay undefeated. If he loses, it can't be too many times like Aldo or Anderson Silva, because once you get like 8 losses, that's when people start to question you. And I know that those losses came at the end of Anderson Silva and Jose Aldo's career, but that's still something on your record that leaves a bad taste in fans' mouths when you've lost to 8 different people. Now, GSP and DJ, they had few losses. They didn't have as many losses, and they avenged their losses. So that's very, very important. You know, DJ came back and beat Marias. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He beat Marias right after he beat him, and he beat him in the exact same way. So like that's pretty spectacular. And then you had GSP coming back and beating Matt Hughes in devastating fashion as well. So they kind of got those losses back. And if you can do that and it's not too many losses, you can take a couple losses along the way. I don't think anybody looks at GSP's record and is just like, oh, well, he lost to Matt Serra that one time, therefore he's not the GOAT, right? I don't think that muddies his record too much. And then you have John Jones. He's not a clean undefeated fighter. There's the no contest and the illegal elbows, so it's not a clean undefeated record. So undefeated isn't absolutely necessary, but it is something that you would like to see on his resume by the end of his career. Now, double champ status or even triple champ status would help his case if he had a couple more losses. So if he had, 2-3 losses, maybe he avenged 2 of them, or maybe he avenged all 3 of them, but he has 2 belts in 2 different weight classes, or he has 3 belts in 3 different weight classes. I think that can kind of level the scales for him. So that is something to consider. And because he only has to go up and down 10 pounds in weight, unlike the heavier divisions, I think it might be a little bit easier for him to actually collect those 3 belts. Next up would be title fight wins. So he would need, I think, 15 title fight wins to match the record. If he had 15 title fight wins from like right now going on, he would actually match, or actually I think he would beat Silva's 16 fight winning streak. So that's big. Like if he can win 15 fights from here, I know that that's a lot to ask from Ilia. And a lot of you may be thinking, there's no way Ilia is going to go from now till the next 8 years just undefeated, winning 15 fights in a row at 145. I know a lot of people are going to doubt that. I'm just making a hypothetical here and like, what if he does that? Because if he does, I think it's pretty clear that he would become the GOAT. Now, you guys can let me know in the comments, how many title fights does he need to win for you guys to consider him the GOAT? For me, he would kind of have to match the record that's already established. Most wins, most subs, most KOs, I don't think any of that is needed, like all time in the sport. I don't think you need the most wins of all time, the most submissions, or the most knockouts, because Demetrius Johnson, GSP, and John Jones aren't at the top of those lists. The top of those lists are usually like Arlovsky or Jim Miller, right? We don't usually consider those guys the GOATs. Sure, they have great longevity, but they're not exactly the GOAT. So I don't think matching those records matters. It's more so getting the title fight wins, staying undefeated, and just getting the most belts you possibly can. Next up, I want to look at his schedule, kind of the trajectory for Ilia. So if he's going to fight at 145, 135, and 155, which I'm kind of making that decision for him right now. He hasn't exactly verbalized wanting to go back down to 135. I know he said he wants to go up to 155, but let's, for the sake of argument, kind of play out his career trajectory here. I'm going to give a low, medium to high difficulty rating for how I think these fights will go for Ilia. But starting out with Max Holloway, I think that's the next fight to book, especially with UFC 300 going how it went. I really, really want to see that fight. I hope it happens in Spain. If it happens in the Bernabeu, like, I might sell my liver to go see that. I want to go visit that stadium so bad. But Max Holloway, I think, is a mid to high difficulty fight. The reason why I say mid to high is because it can be a mid difficulty fight if Ilia comes in there and just boxes his head off for 5 rounds and mixes in the takedowns and uses a full game plan and just triggers Max Holloway the whole fight by just being super, super stubborn with those takedowns and making it a tough fight, I think it can be a mid-difficulty fight for him. But for the most part, I'm going to lean more towards high difficulty because I think he'll want to show that he's the best boxer in the UFC. So he's going to stand with Max Holloway. And if you stand with Max Holloway, I don't care who you are, you could be winning the fight like Volkanovski. Max still is going to make it a close fight, right? Every single fight Max had with Volkanovski, maybe you can argue differently. But I think every single fight he had with Volk was very, very close. You could argue rounds for Max. You could argue maybe Max won 1 or 2 of those fights. So I think it'll be a very, very close fight if he does fight Max. If he fights Ortega, I think that's a mid-difficulty fight only because Ortega is so deadly with the submissions. But I think the wrestling and the jiu-jitsu skills from Ilia, if it goes to the ground, I think Ilia's okay. I think that he can survive on the ground. I think he could probably even choke out Ortega. I mean, he's choked out Bryce Mitchell and Ryan Hall, so maybe he adds Ortega to that resume as well. Iloev, I think, is a mid-difficulty fight, only because Iloev is so technical and he's a very sound, smart fighter. There's not really any attributes that scare me with Iloev. I don't think he's going to like knock out Ilia or take him down and submit him, but he might be so smart, so technical that he might frustrate Ilia and make it a close fight. But that also could be a low difficulty fight if Ilia just comes in there and knocks him out right away. Yair Rodriguez, I'm saying mid just because Yair is just so freaky, man. Those kicks, the way he throws kicks, he is one of the most creative fighters on the roster, and he legit could knock out anybody. I know the fight with Volk doesn't make him look that great, but in certain fights, Yair looks like the best fighter on the planet. So I'll put mid-difficulty for that. Arnold Allen, I'll put mid-difficulty as well, just because I think he's probably the second or third best boxer in that division, and it would be a very, very fun fight. Arnold Allen's boxing is just tremendous. I mean, that fight with Max was very, very close, right? So I would still side with Ilia for that, but I think just how close their boxing levels are, I would say it's a mid-difficulty fight. Aljamain Sterling, another one that I think is a mid-difficult, maybe even high-difficulty fight because his ground game is so good. I think it's better than Ortega's. I think it's better than Hall's. I think it's better than Bryce Mitchell's. You can argue with me on that, but I think Aljo is so sticky and so strong that if he does get your back, it's over. But again, if Sean O'Malley can knock out Aljo, Ilia definitely can. So I think it's probably mid to high difficulty fight. Lopez, mid difficulty. I'm not going to say high yet. Let Lopez get a couple more fights, but that's a super, super exciting fight. I want to see that fight at some point in the future. Lopez is a very, very exciting young fighter. I know a lot of fans out there want to see him become champ one day. Maybe he can, but he'll have to get past Ilia. Ige, Giga, Cater, I don't exactly see them fighting for the belts. But if they do somehow get a shot, they go on a great win streak, I probably give Ilia low difficulty against all those guys. If Ilia fights Calvin Kattar, I love Calvin Kattar. I think he's a great boxer, but I think Ilia will just piece him up. At 155, this is where almost literally every single fight at 155, I'm just going to blank slate say it's high difficulty because they're 155ers. They're a lot bigger than Ilia. Ilia's only 5'7". You have to keep that in mind. So if he goes up in weight, he's going to be fighting guys who are about 5'11" on average. That's 4 inches taller than him. So they're all going to be high difficulty fights if he goes up to 155. Now, can he win them all? I think so, because he has the skills to do it. But let's look at who he might have to face. Islam, being the champ, that would be his hardest fight. I'm a huge fan of Islam and Ilia. That would be an amazing fight for me to watch. The X's and O's in that are so interesting. I could break that down for like an hour. I won't get into the details of that yet. But yeah, Islam, that would be a very tough fight for Ilia. So would Arman Tsarukyan. That would be a very tough fight for him as well. Very similar in styles. I think Arman might even have slightly better wrestling than Ilia. It's hard to say, but that would be another very close fight. Charles, again, you can never count out Charles, even though he's been stopped 8 times. You can never count that guy out. He just finds ways to win against very difficult opponents. And Justin, Dustin, Michael Chandler, Conor McGregor, Gamrot, Fiziev, Saint Denis, all of those guys are such difficult fights for Ilia. I mean, they're all difficult fights for each one of them. 155 is the most stacked division on the planet, and it's the most stacked it's ever been. That division's tough. If Ilia wants to run through 155, he's going to have to put on some weight, and he's going to have to game plan like a mother. Like he's going to have to go in there so sharp in order to beat all those guys. Anyways, if he goes down in weight to 135, I think he has a little bit of an easier career path. So Sean, low difficulty. I don't think Sean O'Malley is going to outbox Ilia Tuporia. Now, I could be wrong. Sean does have those 4 inches in height, and he does have quite a bit of a long reach. But I think Ilia just technically is a much better boxer. I think his ground game is something to be feared. He could probably take Sean down and choke him out if he wanted to. So I say low difficulty for Sean. Merab, I'm saying that they're not going to fight each other because they're friends. But if they did fight each other, I would say it's probably mid difficulty, just because Merab might slightly edge him in the wrestling. And I say slightly because Ilia's wrestling is overlooked, I think. But I think Merab edges Ilia in the wrestling, but I think Ilia edges Merab in the striking. So I think it's a very close fight. I don't want to see the fight, even though in my head it makes me excited, because they're friends, and I think friends should just avoid each other for the most part. And then Corey Sandhagen, mid difficulty, just because he's awkward and sometimes his output's a little low. So if Ilia has a really high output, it's going to be hard for Sandhagen to catch up to him. And if it goes to the ground, Sandhagen's great on the ground, but I don't see him getting around Ilia. Ilia's just, he's so solid. I mean, he's a black belt in jiu-jitsu and a great wrestler. That's a very tough combination to get around when you're on the ground. Peter Yan, mid difficulty. I would love to see that fight just because the boxing styles would be so cool to see matched up against each other. But Umar, another mid difficulty fight. That's another dream fight for me. I'd love to see Umar versus Yan as well, but Umar's tough. Umar, I would almost say, is a high difficulty fight just because Umar is so technical. He's so good with the boxing and the kickboxing, and then his wrestling is probably as good, if not better, than Ilia's because he has that Dagestani style. And then Figgy's the other guy who at 135 would be a very interesting fight for Ilia. That's another mid to high difficulty fight. Figgy, it's hard to gauge. Those Moreno fights, it looked like he was a bit drained. Some of them I think he won when he lost, and those fights were weird. They were great fights, but they were weird fights, and I think he was a little bit drained. He looked much better against Garbrandt, so we'll see. We'll see how Figgy's career plays out, but he could be a very tough fight, not just for Ilia, but anybody at 135. And maybe even going up. I mean, he's such a built guy. You know, Figgy might even be able to go up to 145. Who knows? But those are kind of the fighters who I see him fighting at 145, 155, and 135. So out of those 23 fighters that I just named, Ilia would have to beat at least 15 of them in a row across 2 to 3 weight divisions over the next 8 to 10 years, putting him at the age of 35 to 37 years old. That's when I would hope that he would retire or look at retiring. Past the age of 35 to 37, you're going to decline a lot and you're probably going to lose a fight, and then you're going to turn into Anderson Silva, unfortunately, right? So let's just assume that he stops at 37 while undefeated. He would be retiring 30-0 with 16 title wins / defenses, 2 to 3 belts, and he would be the most decorated fighter of all time because of all those names I just mentioned. If he beat any 15 of them, he would have the best resume the sport has ever seen. So if Ilia can win 15 fights against those 23 guys I just mentioned, I think Ilia could possibly become the next GOAT in the UFC. Now, that's a lot of ifs. That's a lot if, ands, or buts. It's a long way to become a champion, and it's a much, much longer way to become the GOAT. And I'm just making this video because I'm excited. You know, I like seeing the new young talent. I want Connor Bedard to be better than Connor McDavid, even though I live in Edmonton. I want Lamine Yamal to be better than Leo Messi, even though I'm a huge Leo Messi fan. I want Wembanyama to be better than LeBron. Probably won't happen, but who knows? I like to see that new young talent become the next great thing, right? That's super, super exciting for me. Even though John Jones is my favorite fighter of all time, I want somebody to eventually eclipse his records. I think that that's exciting. I don't want it to be kind of a situation like Wayne Gretzky, where even though McDavid is the best player we've ever seen touch the ice, he's never going to beat all the records that Gretzky had because of time error. If you follow hockey, you know why, but I don't want to see that. I don't want to see just a GOAT from the past always be the GOAT. I want to see new GOATs coming in all the time. So that's kind of why I made this video today. You guys can let me know down in the comments if you guys think this path for Ilia is at all plausible. Also, let me know down in the comments if there's any other fighters on the roster who you think have a better shot at becoming the GOAT. Please let me know, and maybe I'll make a video on them in the future. I'm going to be taking a couple weeks here to move out, so if I am a little bit short on the videos coming out weekly, don't worry, I will be getting back to like a full schedule in about a month or so. I just got to move into a new place. I won't have roommates, so there'll be a lot more content coming your guys' way. I'm going to get better at editing, make these videos a little bit more spicy for you guys, so look forward to that. Don't forget to like and subscribe, help boost this channel in the algorithm. Thank you guys so much for watching. It means the world to me. I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.